Wanted to talk to you about crossover capacitors briefly here, especially the inline capacitors for tweeters and mid-ranges. When I say they're inline, I mean that literally the capacitor here, in the case of this electrolytic capacitor, is put in series with your tweeter. So all your sound signals have to run through this before it ever gets to the tweeter. And what this does is it filters out the low frequencies so that you don't blow the tweeter out. Now, because it's in line, it's going to have sonic consequences. There's just no way around that. It's taking apart the frequency that is being passed into it, removing some of the frequencies and allowing the other to pass through, hopefully unharmed. Now, how good does that occur? That's the question. So here I've got three different capacitor types that I pulled out of some speakers that I've worked on. What you typically find is these common electrolytic caps. They're probably the lowest quality that you're going to find, but you'll see these used, especially in older vintage speakers, but you'll still see them used in newer speakers for the capacitors that go in parallel, where they're not in line, but they're actually in parallel, so they filter out high frequencies for the woofers. But that's not that common, and that's not what I want to talk about anyway. This is a normal electrolytic. Here is an oil bath capacitor that I pulled out of a pair of Klipsch Lascalas, and this is quite bigger. I'll say that, but it still has the same characteristics of frequency comes in, goes through there, and gets filtered out, and then comes out the other side. Lastly, I've got a more modern film cap. This is a Dayton Audio film cap, and these just are sonically superior. They don't introduce any artifacts, as much artifacts as some of the older capacitors. Now, some people say, oh, if you change out the capacitors in the crossover network and speakers, you're altering the original sound. And that is true. You're doing that. I mean, these Lascalas sounded very unique with these oil-based capacitors in them. But what I'd like to point out is that what you're doing here is you're improving the sound, because capacitor technology has come a long way in the last 40, 50, 60 years. You can imagine how much signal gets modified when it goes through a capacitor that's built like this, as opposed to one that has been engineered to try to avoid that, to be sonically neutral. And I'll give you a good example here with a pair of speakers that I got. These are a pair of Genesis Physics M1s, and these are quite old. These are from about 1970 or so, 72. And these have an interesting tweeter in them. It's called an inverted dome tweeter. If those of you that remember old vintage speakers, you typically had cone tweeters to begin with, and then they invented dome tweeters, which stick out. And the dome tweeters were a lot better than the cone speakers. Well, this inverted dome tweeter is a variation that turned out to be quite exceptional. It's just a really good tweeter. Even though it was built back in the day, it still sounds really, really good and reproduces high frequencies quite well. So for this pair of speakers, I decided to pay the most money I could and get the best capacitors possible. And I used Jansen Superior Z caps. And they ran $50 a piece just for the capacitors. But when I got them in place, the difference was breathtaking. And it wasn't so much in the sonic quality of the sound as much as it was in the sound stage and the imaging. The better cap allowed the frequencies to pass through unmolested or less molested, And that allowed the imaging to be very, very precise in the center. I mean, I listen to various test tracks when I test my speakers, and some of them have sounds coming directly from the left and directly from the right, and others have sounds coming from behind. And for those of you that have never heard imaging from behind when you're playing your two-channel stereo, if you've never heard that before, it can be quite breathtaking when you hear it for the first time. Because true stereo will reproduce a three-dimensional soundstage if you've got good speakers, and that means really good tweeters, and if you have a good crossover network in place that doesn't molest the signal so much. So for the purists that say, you're altering the sound, it's true. It's true. You are altering the sound of the speaker when you upgrade the capacitors, but you're improving it so dramatically. It's almost always worth it. So I always go with the most expensive capacitors that I'm willing to spend money on, depending on the value of the speaker that I'm putting them in, of course, But if I have a pair of speakers that I want to keep forever, I will put very, very high quality capacitors in them so that I can get the best results out of the tweeters and the mid-ranges.